Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Klint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today I'm joined by Cris Casey, an M&A execution and integration expert with more than 3 decades of hands-on experience, helping deal teams navigate complex initiatives across corporate development, private equity, and advisory environments. Cris has spent years inside real integrations where the plan looks sound on paper, but execution friction, unclear ownership, and coordination drag threatened outcomes. This led Cris to create the CRISP method, and he is now the author of Optimizing M&A Execution with CRISP, Mitigating the Risk of Using Yesterday's Playbooks in Today's World. It's a book focused on why traditional execution methods struggle in modern M&A. In this episode, we explore what breaks during execution, how self-inflicted complexity shows up inside integrations, and how leaders can think differently about getting deals across the finish line. Cris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Clint. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. You know, we've been talking for a while, Cris, and I don't think I've ever asked, how did you find your way into the world of M&A, and what drew you to the execution side rather than deal strategy?
Well, my career has spanned several different venues, let's put it that way, and I've been essentially a self-employed consultant over that period of time. And I started out in the Marcom business doing production work of all different kinds of media. And that's project related, and you're working with clients, and you've got a give and take that goes on there. Not a lot of M&A activity in the Marcom side of things. Communication is a separate issue. And then I got into software development, bespoke software development, and again, working with clients and doing projects and putting these complicated things together. But not a lot of M&A activity there either. And so that was about, 10 or 20 years of my early career, but I'm at the same time, I'm honing my project management and program management skills. And then I started getting more and more, I got out of the software side of things because I knew that I was not, as an individual, I was not going to be able to compete. And I didn't want to be a coder. And so I just no, I'll use that technical skill later on, but I'll just move into pure project and program management. And at that point, I started getting pulled into initiatives that were either as a result of M&A or that were happening during an M&A process. For example, a client said, we're going to be building this CRM system, actually a service system, because we're acquiring this major printing distribution company. And they have this, 150 service techs who are out there. So we're going to put in this new system, but we also want you to help with the re-engineering of how they do their jobs, given the new system, but also given that they're going to be in a new environment. And so as time goes by, I get more and more of these where I'm either on the edge of the M&A or I'm directly in it, or as has been the case, I do a lot of rescue work. And it's at the point where things start to break down that I'm brought in, and it's how do we get out of this? And so that really kind of, gets me into the thick of M&A, where in my later years, probably more than half of the engagements that I've been involved with have M&A components to them, if not the component. And then the last engagement, just to kind of cap this off, I had a client who had actually 3 M&A transactions, a carve out, a spinoff, and an acquisition. And they trusted me enough and with what I was putting forward to them to bring me in to handle all 3 of them on their side. And those were actually sell side transactions, which is a little bit different than on the buy side. but actually requires a little bit more finesse because the seller um, has a tendency their set of priorities, let's put it this way, are different than the buyers,
Right.
especially when it comes to protecting their workforce from unnecessary interruption and those types of things. So that's how I've kind of backed into it. And then after I had done those three, I looked back and I said, you know what? I'm going to pull all my expertise together and what I've found that works and where the disconnects are with the traditional methods, which I've tried. I was a PMP back when there were only 20,000 PMPs out there. Now there are over 1 million. And with Scaled Agile and Scrum and all of those, and they all fall short where M&A is concerned. And so I took a hard look at that and got the book, started to get the book ready, and then used my clients' feedback to move squarely into the M&A and have adopted that as my new home.
That's great. Well, let's talk about that for a minute, Cris. So, when you look at the deals that you've been part of, you mentioned doing a lot of rescue work, and I feel like that's a common theme, right? The first 100 days go okay, and then after that, when you're trying to actually create value, you've got to dive in. I've heard it called merger repair or reintegration, rescue work, but it all amounts to some sort of firefighting. How do you think about the core execution problems that leaders are underestimating that create the need for all of this rescue work?
Yeah, well, uh, uh, I would put it squarely in uh, one point, which is that leaders, they underestimate the cumulative effect of communication problems, and that the problems don't have to be big. And in fact, most of them are small, but they are additive.
Mm.
And in some cases, multiplicative. If I can, that's a word. It sounds like it might be.
It is now.
It is now. Um, that just cascade and make things worse as time goes on. And, I'm fond of saying project in time will not help a project in crisis. It,
No.
it will make it worse. And it's that communication level that they seem to they just don't they take it for granted. They assume that things are going to work out. And what happens on that is that it creates things like ambiguous ownership. So,
Mhm.
the assumption is someone is doing it, but the reality is that they're not. You've got instances where the separate work streams are all doing separate trackers and none of it is tied together. And there are these little there's vernacular issues that come along with that. So you can do a pretty clean looking plan that seems rational and everything's there. But when it comes down to the actual execution, if your communication isn't intentional, and this is not like, oh, yes, well, standard PMI practice says we have to have a communication plan.
Right.
Well, no, well, yes, a communication plan is useful, but it's the in the trenches communication that really is going to make a difference. The top down communication and the broadcasts of intent, and we have to, the holding up the alignment flag and saying because we've pulled everybody into the same room and we've told them all the same message, then they are all aligned. And it's
Right.
like, no, it doesn't it doesn't work like that. It's never worked like that. And historically, you look at it and say, this type of problem, and it's not just germane to the M&A space, it's across all project stuff. Why hasn't it gotten any better in the last 50 years?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a fair question, and it's one that as we've dug into, or at least as I've dug into some of the best practices amongst acquirers, it seems like those that do this a lot and build muscle, they eventually get to a point of understanding that, but less experienced acquirers tend to underestimate the value of real communication. And I think that's where your thinking really helps fill in the gap. So I'd love to ask for an example, Cris, of a time where you were working on a plan. It looked great on paper because, I mean, don't they all? Well, maybe not, but most of them look good on paper. But the reality of that communication breakdown really forced something to happen. So can you maybe give an example to our listeners?
Sure. Over my career, I've seen, oh, I don't know, thousands of plans. And and I've seen a genesis of the planning tools, right? So back when PCs first came out, there was a product called Instaplan, which was one of the first planning tools out there where you could actually connect dependencies from one task to the next. But invariably, and I can't think of a single instance where I ran into a client who presented me with a project plan, like in Microsoft Project or in a more robust tool that did not have lots of TBDs as far as the resources who were attached to some tasks and estimates that were based on nothing but either the schedule that someone had put out or what management thought how long it should take with no consultation to the subject matter experts at all with regard to, well, how does this fit in with your workflow, right? Because in most M&A transactions, you're overlaying on top of the existing work that the SMEs are doing. You're overlaying all this additional work to do the M&A, to do the transaction itself, the initiative. So I had one client who came in and the my guy who I was dealing with, which was the controller, said, I'm I'm just not getting the feeling that we're making the right progress here. And so we took a look at the plan, and the plan looked pretty good, although still, and I learned this kind of late, task oriented, and task oriented is a factory mindset. We're decades past that,
Yeah.
but most plans are put in that way. And they either didn't have any dependencies attached to them, or their resources were missing, or the resources that they had called out didn't have the bandwidth to do the job. And so it's like, well, let's hurry up and get this done. And here's the plan, but the plan, it looks good on paper, but it's unworkable because it didn't take into the reality of what everybody's doing. And so that resource, that disconnect between the resource and the plan, it starts there and it just goes downhill from there. Because, unless you are a huge, huge corporation with millions of dollars to spend on administrative tactics to try and maintain a plan like that with all the dependencies and then have to action it. It's like, no, there's a simpler way to do this. And if you're trying to speed along, but you don't have clarity in terms of the road ahead and
Yeah.
the things that people are doing, it's just going to multiply your cost.
Yeah. Without a doubt. Well, and I can tell you, having spent time on the M&A teams of 4 of the Fortune 500s that had the resources to throw at that kind of planning, they don't do it either. I've been on literally one project out of the over 150 deals that I've participated in where there was somebody in the IMO who was tracking it like that type of plan with interdependency. So I think you're right. It's a lot of grassroots work and those connections, which leads me to, you've got a really fun series on LinkedIn about self-inflicted complexity. And I would encourage folks to check it out because they're really short lessons learned and they're really true. So in your experience, when we think about this sort of complexity that we self-impose or the mismatch between reality and the way that the deal was planned, where does that come from inside of deal teams? And why do you think deal teams struggle to really see that when they're in the thick of it?
I think a lot of it has to do with institutional knowledge and in some cases it's, I want to say, I'll use the word misplaced, misplaced trust and or assumptions that one particular group over another is going to have the secret to how this needs to be planned and managed. So, for instance, a lot of the initiatives that I've seen, essentially, there was no formal IMO that was set up. The management of it fell to the IT group,
Okay.
and there's a kind of logical reason to that because IT is seen as the standard bearers for process and regularity and, that type of discipline. But the reality is that planning in IT and doing things just with IT doesn't give you the full scale or the full scope of what has to happen. And so the natural reaction to that then, both from IT if they're charged with it or an IMO would be, well, we've got to get better understanding of what's happening here. So they add in extra reporting, they add in duplicated governance that, we're going to set up this little group over here and it's going to somehow triage some of these things that are going on. We need more documentation, which creates more lag. And so all of those things, all those little things essentially build up into this administrative drag. And places like BCG and the PMI and KPMG, they all point to it and they say, look, this is an issue. And so those types of self-inflicted things where they try to put in a solution, it could be a technical solution as well, and adding these layers of alleged control really doesn't it doesn't do it. And your governance, right, which is going to support those things, if you're doing the right things, it'll stabilize the situation. But you can also have governance in there that essentially compounds the problem by saying, oh, well, this is a problem during this transaction. Now we're going to build a rule, set up a policy, whatever it is, to deal with that specific thing, which on the next deal actually isn't an issue, but gets acted on as if it is, along with the administrative drag and the burden that's placed on the subject matter experts. And it's self-inflicted. I mean, this is, they're not solving for the actual problem. They're solving for the appearance of the problem and then pushing that forward, which then gets built into the culture, gets built into the playbook, whatever it is, and is never revisited again as to the validity. So.
Right. I stubbed my toe once and now I'm going to make sure that never happens again.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So, Cris, I know you've seen a lot of different deals out there in your experience. What are some of the early integration decisions that tend to create a lot of downstream pain?
So, I think probably and we kind of touched on this earlier, not having clear decision rights in terms of who's doing what, when are they doing it, how far can they go, and if something happens, how do we intentionally escalate and intelligently escalate that to solve the problem without falling back to, well, we escalate everything up to the executive steering committee. We have a problem, it goes to the executive steering committee. And it's like, well, that's kind of your last resort, or it should be your last resort, right? And so those types of decisions early on, where either the decision rights are ambiguous, right, which causes then a cascading effect of, well, who do I call, who do I see to do this or to get a decision on this, and that creates more meetings, which creates more noise and more confusion. And so if you don't have that in place, I would say that number one, if you don't have that in place, you're going to suffer. It's going to be frustrating, not only for management, but for the field teams as well, everybody involved. So get your decision rights, get your escalation paths nailed down up front, right? This is before the close, because there's nothing, my lawyer friends have warned me. And in fact, as part of the editing of the book, had said that, you really need a section in here that says, check with your legal team to make sure that your pre-close communication is within the bounds of whatever your industry is. Because you can, easily say, oh, well, there's collusion here of some sort, right, or improper. But there's a whole lot of stuff that ahead of time, that you can define, that you can agree to. I'll give you one quick example of this. I did a $1 billion carve out, And before the deal closed, I met with the CFOs and said, listen, we've got this transition services agreement that we're going to need to execute. I want to nail down how we're going to handle the invoicing, how we're going to handle the changes, right? Because we know there are changes. It's
Right.
built into the process where you finish, the seller finishes his piece of this, does knowledge transfer, and then it's the buyer's responsibility.
Right.
Let's get all that worked out before the close, right? So that when the close hits, we don't have to worry about any of that. And sure enough, we didn't have to worry about it. That particular engagement had zero administrative issues. And we were billing out, millions of dollars. And, the chances for things to go wrong because somebody would say, wait a minute, we didn't agree to this. No, well, we agreed early on how this was going to be handled. And then that just smoothed the way through the entire process. So that's the long answer. I'm sorry to your question.
No reason to be sorry. I can't imagine that there aren't people out there that have gone through the pain of administering a transition services agreement who aren't nodding their heads vigorously right now. So
I hope so.
yeah, no, it's a great approach. One of the themes that I'm hearing here, Cris, is around leadership alignment, so decision rights, governance, escalation pathways. As I've been talking with people about integration debt, that cost associated with misdirected integration, that real financial impact, I'm hearing a lot from them around leadership alignment as well. So I'd love to hear a story about where leadership alignment maybe broke down in the middle of an integration and how that may have changed your current approach.
Let me give you one story, which is kind of typical, I guess, where we've got a seller, we've got a buyer on either side. And things start to execute. And all of a sudden, this one person who's responsible for a key deliverable that's sitting on the ever-changing critical path doesn't deliver. And so that gets escalated. And the first escalation under my model, it goes to the work stream lead, right? So
Okay.
let's try and get this resolved on a local level first. And the work stream lead met with the guy, said, what's the problem here? I don't have the bandwidth to do this. So now we've got two problems, right? One is bandwidth. The second is understanding what the priorities are. So the workstream lead escalates that into the IMO, but the IMO already knew that the deliverable was late. So they had an inkling that something was wrong. And so the workstream lead goes into, I've got this problem. Okay, let us try and facilitate a solution to this. So they arranged to meet with the resources boss. And the resources boss says, well, I redirected Jimmy to do this work because my boss, the CFO, told me that this needed to be done and had a top priority. And it is kind of related to what it's part of this initiative. And so it was like, well, okay, but that still doesn't solve the problem of the downstream trouble that this is causing, not getting this deliverable.
Mm-hmm.
So the meeting was then held, pulled in the CFO and said, what's going on here? Well, what we found out is that there was leadership alignment where the CFO on the sell side and the CFO on the buy side had come up with this separate deal of what they needed and agreed, right, between themselves without notifying anybody else other than their direct reports that this was going to happen. And so the guy's boss, right, has his mandate from his boss that says, do this first above anything else. Mm-hmm. And so when the CFO found out, well, pulling him off of what he was supposed to be doing, and everyone knew he was doing this, nobody knew he was doing this other thing, started to create these downstream issues. So he corrected course by saying, okay, no, now I understand, do this first. then we'll deal with this. And at that point, the IMO then said, let's put this as an agenda item at our next joint steering committee meeting, so we can get both CFOs in the room and say, this is not the right way to do this. If you need something done, that's good, but it needs to be measured with everything else that's going on. You just can't unilaterally and obliviously push something down without understanding what the ramifications are. So that to me is those types of things create friction.
Oh, without a doubt.
And so if you can reduce that friction, not by adding layers, but by just defining and making the communication more intentional and that exchange more intentional, that mitigates a lot of those problems.
That makes a ton of sense. And I know that that happens all the time. I've seen it where a couple of leaders get together, they in their own vacuum believe that they're doing the right thing. It's not malicious at all.
No, 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 no. And it may be perfectly legitimate what what they're asking for and in line with everything else. But if it is a mystery and invisible, then sooner or later it's going to bump up into some realities, unless there's a huge amount of slack and leeway in terms of the timeline and all that type of stuff, which, that happens as well.
It does. It does. Yeah. But without coordinating with everybody else, all of a sudden other things get delayed and it creates other problems. So I love how you frame it up as communication. So, Cris, I know that you pulled all of these lessons that you've learned together, these success stories, as well as the pain points into the CRISP method. So I'm curious, when did it click for you that, hey, this is something that the market could really use, that this would solve a lot of problems? We're still in a world where two-thirds or more, depending on the source that you listen to, two-thirds or more of all deals still fail to meet their financial thesis, right? So companies go into this expecting to make money, or they wouldn't do an M&A investment, and it still falls flat. So, you know, how did this come about that you're like, hey, I think that this is a really good way to fix at least some of the problems causing that failure of M&A?
Yeah. So these last three engagements, or the last engagement with the three segments
Mhm.
to it, really drove the point home to me that if you concentrate on the communication aspects and change the dynamics of how that information is exposed, and then how you change your communication from that point forward in terms of intentionality, right? So and this is a radical departure for how traditional project management, and even with modern, so-called modern techniques like agile, which is, coming up, I guess, on its 25th birthday.
Yeah.
And by the way, I would never use agile as a method to rely on for M&A transactions, mainly because, agile is iterative. And
Right.
M&A is not iterative. It's a linear process tied to a purchase and sale agreement or a letter of intent or legal documents that call out exactly what's going to happen. Now, as for the failures, right? You've got a couple of different failure points. The first failure point is that if you can't execute the basic operations in terms of making the transition, whatever that looks like, right? So it's either pulling an organization into yours and rejiggering the processes, or however that works, or, leaving the company as it stands, but making a few tweaks here and there, the strategy pieces of it. If you don't get the basics down right in terms of the mechanics of the transaction itself, there ain't no way you're going to get to the end.
Right.
You're not going to get to the end. And if you do, you're lucky that happens. And I think that is probably, there's an expectation on both parties, right, of how this is going to run. But the expectation is often not connected with the actual execution. So that's that strategy, that gap, right, between the two. Um, but if you focus on that gap, which traditional project management tools sitting down, defining tasks, defining dependencies and all that type of thing, you know, keep those in the work stream. If your work stream works well with that type of structure and that type of planning, well, then that's fine. Do that for you. But for the entire initiative, right, you need something different because you don't have the time, and you pointed it out, right? Even if you did have the time and money, the cultural impetus or the motivation to do that type of intricate planning and tracking and then burdening the resources, right, with updating their records, whether it's a simple time card. Time cards are one of the worst places in the world to try and get meaningful data in terms of how long something takes. And I flip that on its head. And when we go through any type of planning session, I ask the resources who are doing the work, how long will it take you to do this? Not that we're going to build it into anything, but how long is it going to take you to do this if you had all the information that you needed from outside of your work stream laid at your feet? And the answers are unbelievably telling. If you ask somebody who configures an ERP system, for example, to create a new corporate entity and that type of thing, and on the plan it shows up that it's, the duration is going to take 2 to 3 weeks to get that done. And you ask that person, if you had all the information in front of you, how long would it take you to configure the system? And they think for a bit and they say, maybe 2.5, 3 hours. And you sit there and say, well, why do we have it in the plan that it's going to take 2 or 3 weeks? Well, I've got all these other things that are going on and I don't know when I'm going to get this information. And so part of it's a hedge, part of it's no. When you start focusing in on those things, what you see is this immediate relief, actually, from the people who need the information and the ones who are producing it, because they know exactly who they're producing it for. They've talked to and they've negotiated a delivery date on it. Now, not in a grand sense, but on a very granular, you're delivering this to me, right? And so that commitment and specificity then essentially tamps down all this other angst that happens, the constant calls and emails and I point this out also in the book that, direct messaging and instant messaging, one of the worst places to transfer information because it creates alternate sources of truth. Somebody sends because it's convenient. I know that Betty knows what the tax ID number is. So I'm going to call Betty or I'm going to interrupt her work. And this is what if we go back to the beginning about this friction that's created and cumulative over time. I'm going to I'll send Betty an instant message, do you have the tax ID number? And maybe Betty doesn't have it. And she says, no, try Brad. Well, every time you do that, it creates drag on the initiative. And not just drag for yourself because you're hunting around for stuff, but drag on all these other people who you're touching along the way. And if you fix that problem, which I think I have, that goes away. And in fact, I spoke to one of my clients just the other day and I said, how's it going? And I asked him about this key artifact that's part of the deal. And, oh yeah, every deal we do, it's right there. And I said, well, that's great. And I said, well, what was the decision process? And he just looked at me and he said, why would we do it any other way? It's like, yeah, well, that's how I feel about it.
Yeah. No, that's great. You just brought up so many good points. One is the amount of sandbagging that we do, that hedging that we do, just because information is missing from the system is immense. And then the debt that piles up on top of that, the wasted cycles, the off-channel conversations. I think you're right. I think a lot of the M&A problems I've seen would be solved by cleaner communication, by really trusting the experts to do their work. Most people, in my experience, they want to do a good job. And candidly, M&A is a side project for most of them. So they just as soon get it off their plate quickly then have this extra action item they have to deal with for months and months and months. It sounds to me, Cris, like you're doing a lot of people a big favor by streamlining that process and letting them move on to other parts of their work.
Yes. Well, it requires a willful suspension of disbelief that asking for interim status, for instance, right? Where are you on this? You hear that all, and that's the main focus of most of the meetings where you've got, from the executive committee on down, they get very expensive to hold. And, the first half of the meeting, if not 3/4 of it, is going over stuff that is either already done or has had problems that have occurred that should have been solved further upstream. And you waste all this time, and then you come up with a big next step list, and half of it gets done, but there's really no follow-up on it because everyone is assuming, oh, well, they'll take care of that. And no, it doesn't work that way. And I think that's, the stats and the abysmal success rates, point to something that's more systemic in nature rather than just kind of oh yeah, well, we've got communication problems, or, it was a culture clash, or, well, if you're talking about pieces of information that you need to do your job, there is no culture in that. They're really kind of binary units that say, okay, well, if you're responsible for, I'll use the tax ID number again, going out and getting the tax ID number, well, there is no cultural component to that ask. It's there. But if it's not asked in the concert of, well, who actually needs the tax ID number? And it's not just one person. It's like 5 different functions within the organization, cross-functionally, who need it. And they keep asking for it over and over again from one or more sources. And again, it's this compounding of these communication issues that really will delay and oftentimes create more noise and confusion that is conceptually you're trying to solve with, let's communicate more, let's communicate more broadly so that everybody is aligned. And it's like, no, those two things don't necessarily go together. Broad communication and more frequent does not necessarily equate to alignment.
Right.
And that's a hard thing to grasp because a lot of the traditional approaches to these things require this type of, oh, we need a requirements gathering session for XYZ, or we need a status session to figure out where we are. And it's like, no, every time you do that, you're essentially creating drag within the transaction.
Yeah. Well, Cris, you've certainly given us a lot to think about, a lot to digest today. For folks that want to continue the conversation, learn more, and of course, we'll make sure we have a link to your book in the show notes, but how can folks reach you if they'd like to continue the conversation?
Well, if they're on LinkedIn, I have I won't say a sizable presence, but a presence there. Just remember it's Cris without the H. And the other place to go would be chrismethod.com. That'll give you a readout on the method itself. And then if you want to see some of my other stuff, you could go to chriscasey.com. And that's more historical pieces. I've also there's a big section in there on comments that clients have made over the years about working with me and what I bring to the table, or had brought to the table for their initiative. So that would be a good place to find that. That's chriscasey.com. So,
well, we'll make sure we put links to all of those in the notes. Cris, thank you so much.
Thank you, Klint. I always enjoy talking with you. It's educational on both sides, I think. And I look forward for the next time we get together.
Same here. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Klint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.